You see, most people think power comes from control over others. That's an illusion. Real power comes from mastery of self. And when you show indifference, not bitterness, not cold revenge, but grounded indifference, you step into a frequency that shakes anyone who relies on emotional distance to feel safe. Avoidant individuals survive by running from intimacy, running from vulnerability, running from the truth of what they feel. Their nervous system is wired to believe that closeness equals danger. So they pull away, not because they don't care, but because they care more than they know how to handle. Now here's the breakthrough. When you chase them, you confirm their story. I'm in control. I can leave. I am safe. But when you stop chasing, when you become calm, centered, fulfilled within yourself, you remove the game entirely. And when the game disappears, so does their sense of certainty. Indifference is not punishment. It is presence without attachment. It says, I am whole whether you stay or go. And that is terrifying to someone who has built their identity around escape. Suddenly, the silence gets loud. Suddenly, the space they wanted feels empty. Suddenly, they're left alone with emotions they've buried for years. Because indifference does something powerful. It holds up a mirror. And in that mirror, they don't see you. They see themselves. They feel the loss of relevance, the loss of influence, the loss of the emotional leverage they once had. And the mind scrambles when the old survival strategy stops working. But let me be clear. This isn't about manipulating anyone. This is about alignment. Divine alignment. When you choose self-respect over obsession, peace over proving, purpose over pleasing, you rise. And when you rise, anyone operating from fear feels the ground shift beneath them. The universe responds to certainty. Life responds to boundaries. Love responds to wholeness. Indifference is not absence of love. It's absence of need. And need is what avoidants depend on to feel secure. So when you stop needing, you become free. When you become free, you become unpredictable. And when you are unpredictable, you are powerful. Not because you broke them, but because you finally chose yourself. And here's the divine truth. When you walk in self-worth, you don't chase what runs. You attract what's ready. You release what's not. And anything that loses its mind when you choose peace was never aligned with your destiny to begin with. Stand tall. Stay grounded. Choose your inner authority. That's where transformation begins. Avoidant personalities are not driven by a lack of feeling. They are driven by an overwhelming fear of emotional engulfment and loss of control. At their core, avoidants learned, often very early in life, that closeness comes with a cost. Love felt conditional, inconsistent, or invasive. Instead of safety, intimacy became associated with pressure, expectations, or emotional overwhelm. So the nervous system adapted. Distance became protection. Independence became survival. Control became the substitute for connection. For an avoidant, emotional closeness doesn't feel warm and nourishing. It feels like a threat to autonomy. When someone gets too close, the subconscious alarm goes off. I might be consumed. I might lose myself. I might be trapped. This fear is rarely conscious. They won't articulate it in those words. Instead, it shows up as emotional withdrawal, detachment, intellectualization, or sudden loss of interest right when things start to deepen. The moment intimacy requires presence, vulnerability, or emotional responsibility, the avoidant instinctively pulls back. Control is the currency that keeps them regulated. As long as they can decide when to engage and when to disappear, they feel safe. Distance gives them the illusion of power over their emotional world. They believe that by not needing, they can't be hurt. By staying self-sufficient, they can't be disappointed. But this independence is not true strength. It's a defense mechanism designed to avoid emotional pain. The deeper fear beneath avoidance is not rejection, it is engulfment. Rejection implies being left. Engulfment implies being overwhelmed, consumed, or emotionally dominated. Many avoidants would rather feel lonely than emotionally trapped, so they manage relationships by keeping them just far enough away to breathe, but close enough to avoid total isolation. This creates the classic push-pull dynamic, craving connection, then fleeing from it. Loss of control is especially destabilizing for avoidants because control equals safety. When they feel emotionally dependent, even slightly, it triggers anxiety. Dependence feels dangerous. It reminds them of times when their needs weren't met or when closeness came with emotional chaos. So they suppress needs, minimize attachment, and convince themselves they are better off alone. They don't trust that connection can exist without cost. This is why avoidants often gravitate toward partners who chase, overgive, or emotionally pursue. Not because they want the closeness, but because the other person's investment allows them to stay distant while still receiving attention. The power dynamic remains intact. They can step back while the other leans forward. This preserves their sense of control and prevents the terror of emotional vulnerability. But when control is threatened, when the other person stops chasing, stops overfunctioning, or stops centering them, the avoidant's internal stability collapses. Their coping strategy no longer works. The fear they've been running from begins to surface, not because the other person is gone, but because the illusion of emotional safety through distance has been disrupted. Avoidants are not heartless. They are deeply self-protective. Their nervous system is organized around preventing emotional overwhelm, not around building intimacy. Until they confront the fear beneath the distance, they will continue to confuse emotional withdrawal with strength and autonomy with freedom. In truth, what they are protecting is not independence. It is unhealed attachment trauma that equates closeness with loss of self. Understanding this changes everything. Their behavior is not about you being unworthy or too much. It is about their internal battle between longing for connection and terror of losing control. Distance is the shield, control is the armor, and emotional avoidance is a strategy they learn to survive, not to love. Indifference destabilizes avoidance because it dismantles the familiar push-pull dynamic they unconsciously rely on to feel secure. That dynamic is not accidental. It is a carefully maintained emotional system where one person pursues and the other retreats. The avoidant regulates their sense of safety by controlling proximity, engaging just enough to feel desired, then pulling back before vulnerability sets in. As long as someone is chasing, reassuring, or trying to reestablish connection, the avoidant feels anchored. They know where they stand. They know they have influence. They know they can step away and still be emotionally held in place by the other person's effort. When indifference enters the picture, that structure collapses. Indifference removes the emotional feedback they depend on. There is no pursuit to respond to, no reassurance to ignore, no pressure to resist. The familiar rhythm disappears, and with it their sense of control. What replaces it is uncertainty, and uncertainty is deeply unsettling for someone whose nervous system depends on predictability. ND distance. Avoidants often interpret pursuit as proof of their value and safety. Not in a conscious, ego-driven way, but in a nervous system way. The other person's continued effort tells them, I can retreat and still be wanted. Indifference disrupts this unspoken agreement. It sends a powerful nonverbal message. I am no longer orienting my emotional world around you. This is not rejection, but it feels like a loss of leverage. The emotional center of gravity shifts away from them. Without the push-pull, the avoidant loses their role. They are no longer the ones setting the tempo. They can't predict the other person's movements. They don't know if distance will be followed by pursuit or silence. That lack of predictability creates anxiety because it removes their primary coping mechanism. Distance no longer guarantees control. Indifference also exposes a truth avoidants work hard to avoid, that their withdrawal only has power when someone reacts to it. The moment the reaction disappears, the strategy loses effectiveness. The silence they once used as protection now reflects back to them. They experience the very emptiness they were trying to escape, not because the other person is gone, but because the emotional exchange has stopped feeding their sense of relevance. This is where the mind begins to race. Questions arise that were previously buried under avoidance. Did I miscalculate? Did I matter more than I thought? What if I've lost access to something I wasn't ready to value? Indifference forces introspection, and introspection is uncomfortable for someone who survives by staying disconnected from their inner emotional landscape. The push-pull dynamic also allowed avoidants to externalize emotional responsibility. The pursuer carried the emotional weight, initiating conversations, repairing ruptures, expressing needs. Indifference returns that responsibility back to the avoidant. With no one chasing, they must confront whether they want connection enough to move toward it themselves. That choice feels risky because it requires vulnerability rather than control. Indifference doesn't attack the avoidant. It simply stops participating in the pattern. And when a pattern ends, whatever it was protecting begins to surface. The avoidant may feel restless, irritable, preoccupied, or unusually emotional. This isn't because they suddenly became insecure. It's because the system they depended on for regulation has been removed. What unsettles avoidance most is not the loss of the other person, but the loss of the dynamic that kept them emotionally insulated. Indifference dismantles the illusion that they can stay distant without consequence. It reveals that connection requires reciprocity, and power based on withdrawal only works when someone is willing to chase. When no one does, the avoidant is left face to face with the one thing they've been avoiding all along, their own unprocessed desire for connection. When you stop chasing, something profound happens beneath the surface of an avoidant's mind. Their subconscious attachment wounds are activated. Chasing once served as a buffer between them and their deepest fears. It kept the emotional focus outside of themselves, allowing them to stay regulated without having to confront vulnerability. When that pursuit disappears, the protective layer dissolves, and what remains is raw, unresolved attachment pain. Avoidant attachment is often formed in environments where emotional needs were minimized, ignored, or met inconsistently. The child learns that needing too much leads to disappointment, rejection, or emotional overload. So they adapt by suppressing desire, disconnecting from feelings, and becoming self-reliant beyond their years. As adults, they don't experience this as trauma. They experience it as normalcy, but the wound remains, quietly shaping their reactions to intimacy. Chasing partners unknowingly soothe this wound. The pursuit confirms that closeness is available without the avoidant having to ask for it. It allows them to feel wanted without risking vulnerability. But when you stop chasing, the familiar reassurance vanishes. The nervous system interprets this not as healthy detachment, but as emotional abandonment. Old fears resurface. Maybe I'm not as important as I thought. Maybe connection isn't guaranteed. Maybe I misjudged my place. These thoughts don't always register consciously. Instead, they show up as restlessness, irritability, intrusive thinking, or a sudden fixation on the person who has pulled back. The avoidant may feel unsettled without knowing why. The emotional equilibrium they relied on has been disrupted, and the mind searches for meaning. Stopping the chase also forces the avoidant to confront their own attachment needs they've long denied. They may have believed they didn't need anyone, that closeness was optional, even inconvenient, but when pursuit ends, the absence highlights desire, the silence makes them aware of longing, and longing is dangerous territory for someone who learned early on that wanting leads to pain. This is why avoidants often experience a delayed emotional response. While you were present and available, they felt numb or indifferent. Once you withdraw, emotion floods in. Not because they suddenly value you more, but because the suppression mechanism has failed. The attachment system, once dormant, becomes activated by perceived loss. Your absence also removes a distraction. Chasing kept the focus on managing the other person's expectations rather than confronting their own feelings. Without that distraction, unresolved attachment memories surface. Feelings of being unseen, emotionally alone, or prematurely independent resurface. Not necessarily tied to you, but projected onto the situation. There is also a rupture in identity. Avoidants often define themselves as the one who doesn't need, doesn't cling, doesn't collapse. When you stop chasing, that identity is challenged. If no one is pursuing, then distance no longer equals superiority or safety. It simply becomes absence. This can trigger anxiety, self-doubt, and an urge to reestablish connection, not from security, but from wounded attachment. Importantly, this activation is not a sign of healing, it is a sign of exposure. The subconscious wound has been touched. Some avoidants respond by reaching out, testing the waters, or suddenly expressing interest. Others respond by doubling down on avoidance, convincing themselves they never cared. Both reactions stem from the same source, an attachment system struggling to regain equilibrium. When you stop chasing, you don't cause the wound, you reveal it. You remove the external regulator they were leaning on and return emotional responsibility to where it belongs. What surfaces is not your absence, but the unresolved pain they've been carrying quietly for years. Avoidants often regulate their sense of self-worth through distance, not closeness. From the outside, this can look like confidence, independence, or emotional strength, but internally, it is a learned strategy for maintaining stability. Distance allows them to feel composed, unburdened, and in control of their emotional landscape. It reduces the risk of disappointment, rejection, or emotional overwhelm. As long as they can keep others at arm's length, they feel intact. This pattern usually develops in environments where emotional validation was inconsistent or conditional. The avoidant learns that closeness does not reliably provide safety or affirmation, so they stop seeking self-worth through connectio. Instead, they locate value in self-sufficiency, competence, and emotional restraint. Needing less becomes a badge of honor. Wanting less becomes synonymous with strength. Distance becomes the space where they feel most themselves. In relationships, this translates into a subtle but powerful belief: I am okay because I don't rely on anyone. Their self-worth is reinforced every time they pull back and survive it. Every time they withdraw, and the relationship doesn't collapse, it confirms the narrative that closeness is unnecessary and that independence is superior. Emotional distance becomes the anchor that stabilizes their identity. However, this regulation system is dependent on contrast. Distance only works when there is still someone on the other side of it. The avoidant may not engage fully, but they often assume emotional availability remains accessible if they choose to return. That assumption quietly supports their self-worth. It reassures them that they are wanted without requiring vulnerability. When indifference enters the picture, that emotional anchor disappears. Indifference does not chase, reassure, or remain oriented toward the avoidant. It does not provide feedback that says, "You still matter here." The distance that once felt empowering suddenly feels hollow. Without someone emotionally present on the other end, withdrawal loses its regulating effect. This creates an internal destabilization. The avoidant's usual method of maintaining self-worth no longer works. Distance without emotional availability beneath it feels less like autonomy and more like isolation. The absence of reaction forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable question. If no one is holding the emotional connection open, what does my distance actually mean? Indifference also interrupts the avoidant's ability to feel significant without engagement. When someone remains emotionally invested despite being kept at a distance, it reinforces a sense of importance. Indifference removes that reinforcement. There is no longer evidence that they are desired or prioritized. This doesn't register as rejection in a straightforward way. It registers as a loss of emotional grounding. As a result, avoidants may experience a dip in self-esteem or an uncharacteristic sense of insecurity, not because they suddenly need validation, but because the structure that quietly supported their self-worth has collapsed. They are left without the familiar buffer of emotional distance, paired with guaranteed availability. This can trigger compensatory behaviors. Some avoidants attempt to reestablish contact, flirt, or reassert presence, not from clarity, but from a need to restore equilibrium. Others retreat further, convincing themselves they are better off detached. Both responses reflect an attempt to regain the sense of self that was previously regulated through distance. Indifference exposes a fundamental truth: self-worth built on withdrawal is fragile. It depends on someone else staying emotionally engaged while you remain detached. When that engagement is withdrawn, the illusion of independence is challenged. What remains is not strength, but an unexamined reliance on distance as an emotional crutch. In this way, indifference does not diminish the avoidant. It reveals the limitations of their coping strategy. It removes the emotional anchor they were using to stabilize their sense of worth, and forces them to confront the difference between true inner security and self-worth maintained by emotional disengagement. Silence has a unique psychological power because it removes distraction, and for avoidance, distraction is essential to emotional survival. Avoidant individuals manage their inner world by staying ahead of feelings, keeping busy, staying rational, focusing outward, or maintaining emotional distance so they don't have to sit with what arises inside. When communication is present, even at a minimal level, it provides an external reference point. It gives their mind something to track, interpret, or control. Silence removes that reference point entirely. When you go silent, not as punishment, but as a natural withdrawal of energy, the avoidant is left alone with their internal experience. There is no message to analyze, no reassurance to dismiss, no emotional signal to regulate against. The quiet becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, suppressed emotions begin to surface. Avoidants are not unfamiliar with silence, but they are unfamiliar with emotionally meaningful silence. The silence they choose feels safe because it is controlled. The silence that follows indifference is different. It is not initiated by them, and therefore it cannot be managed. This loss of authorship over the emotional environment creates discomfort. The nervous system becomes alert, scanning for cues that no longer exist. In the absence of external stimulation, the mind turns inward. Thoughts that were previously avoided begin to emerge: unfinished conversations, moments of connection, subtle regrets, unacknowledged feelings. These thoughts are not necessarily romantic or sentimental. They are intrusive because they disrupt the avoidant's carefully maintained emotional neutrality. Silence also dismantles the avoidant's ability to intellectualize. When there is ongoing interaction, they can rationalize distance. This isn't serious. I'm just busy. I don't need this. Silence strips away these narratives. Without ongoing data, the mind can no longer minimize the emotional impact. The question becomes unavoidable. Why does this absence feel uncomfortable? That discomfort is not about losing the other person. It is about encountering parts of themselves they've been avoiding. Longing, vulnerability, sadness, and fear rise to the surface because there is nothing left to suppress them. Silence creates space, and space invites truth. For avoidance, emotions feel dangerous not because they are overwhelming, but because they feel unmanageable. Emotions require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement threatens the belief that they are unaffected. Silence gently but firmly challenges that belief. It reveals that emotional detachment is not the absence of feeling, but the suppression of it. There is also a spiritual dimension to silence that many avoidants unconsciously resist. Silence invites reflection, presence, and stillness, states that expose inner fragmentation. When the noise of interaction fades, the soul speaks. Old wounds, unmet needs, and unresolved grief find their voice. This can feel destabilizing for someone who equates emotional stillness with loss of control. As silence stretches on, the avoidant may experience an urge to break it, not necessarily to reconnect deeply, but to restore equilibrium. Reaching out, testing boundaries, or creating superficial contact becomes a way to escape introspection. It is an attempt to re-establish an external focus and quiet the internal unrest. Yet the silence continues to work, regardless of whether contact resonates. Once emotions have been felt, they cannot be unfelt. The awareness that surfaced lingers. The avoidant now knows that beneath the detachment, there is emotional life, messy, unresolved, and real. Silence doesn't accuse, it doesn't demand. It simply removes the escape routes. And in doing so, it forces avoidants to confront the very feelings they built their identity around avoiding. What emerges in that quiet space is not weakness but truth. Truth they may not be ready to face, but can no longer deny. Indifference communicates self-respect, boundaries, and inner certainty without a single word, and this is precisely what makes it so powerful. Unlike emotional reactions that seek validation or control, indifference is quiet confidence. It signals that your sense of worth is not contingent on another person's attention, approval, or behavior. For avoidants, who are highly attuned to power dynamics in relationships, this shift is deeply unsettling. Avoidants are accustomed to relating from a position where emotional distance gives them leverage. They expect others to respond to withdrawal with concern, pursuit, or explanation. These responses reaffirm their role as the one who decides how close the connection will be. Indifference interrupts this expectation. It communicates that you recognize your own value and are willing to disengage rather than negotiate it. Boundaries expressed through indifference are different from boundaries expressed through confrontation. There is no argument to win, no behavior to justify, no emotional energy being offered. The message is simple and embodied. I know where I stand, and I do not need to prove it. This kind of boundary cannot be debated or manipulated. It exists regardless of the other person's reaction. For an avoidant, this creates cognitive and emotional dissonance. Their usual strategies, pulling away, minimizing, or staying ambiguous, no longer produce the expected outcome. Instead of gaining space with influence, they gain space without relevance. This reveals a critical distinction they often avoid. Distance does not equal power unless someone is still emotionally invested. Inner certainty is especially confronting because it reflects something avoidants struggle to access internally. They often appear self-assured, but their confidence is conditional. It relies on staying in control of closeness and avoiding emotional exposure. Indifference reflects a deeper form of security, one that is rooted in self. Trust, rather than avoidance. This contrast highlights the fragility of the avoidance coping mechanisms. Self-respect also shifts the energetic dynamic. When you no longer over-explain, seek reassurance, or attempt to be chosen, you step out of the role that supported the avoidance emotional equilibrium. You are no longer participating in the unspoken agreement where one person withholds and the other compensates. This reclaims your authority and recenters the relationship around mutual choice rather than emotional imbalance. Avoidants may interpret this as coldness or detachment, but what they are actually sensing is emotional sovereignty. Indifference does not collapse into resentment or performative strength. It remains steady. That steadiness communicates that your boundaries are not reactive, they are principled. This removes the avoidance ability to frame your responses as emotional volatility or neediness. There is also a moral clarity embedded in indifference. It reflects a decision to honor your own emotional limits. You are no longer available for ambiguity, inconsistency, or half-connection. This clarity forces the avoidant to confront a reality they often evade. Connection requires reciprocity. Without it, distance is no longer a neutral choice. It becomes a cost. Indifference also removes the avoidant's ability to define the narrative. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop giving them material to reinterpret or dismiss. The absence of emotional negotiation leaves them with only one interpretation: you have chosen yourself. That choice cannot be undone by charm, withdrawal, or mixed signals. What unsettles avoidance most is not the boundary itself, but the calm with which it is held. Calm implies confidence. Confidence implies options. Options imply that they are no longer the center of your emotional universe. This realization destabilizes the din. Amic, because it places both individuals on equal footing. Indifference, when rooted in self-respect, is not rejection. It is alignment. It communicates that your presence is intentional, not obligatory. And for someone accustomed to emotional imbalance, encountering someone who stands firmly in their own certainty is both confronting and transformative. Avoidants often grow up equating emotional unavailability with strength, because in their early environment, detachment was rewarded and vulnerability felt unsafe. They learned that staying composed, self-contained, and unaffected was the best way to survive emotionally. Expressing needs may have been ignored, criticized, or met with inconsistency, so they adapted by minimizing desire and maximizing self-reliance. Over time, this adaptation solidified into a belief: the less I need, the stronger I am. This belief shapes how avoidants see themselves and others. They admire emotional restraint and often feel uncomfortable around open vulnerability. When someone expresses longing, attachment, or emotional depth, the avoidant may interpret it as weakness, neediness, or lack of self-control, not because it truly is, but because it mirrors the very parts of themselves they were forced to suppress. Emotional unavailability becomes their version of power, an armor that keeps them from feeling exposed. In relationships, this dynamic is reinforced when partners overinvest emotionally. The avoidance withdrawal is often met with increased effort, reassurance, or emotional expression from the other person. This reinforces the avoidance internal narrative: I am strong because I don't need as much. They need me more than I need them. This imbalance falsely validates emotional distance as superiority. However, when indifference is mirrored back, the illusion begins to crack. Indifference looks similar to emotional unavailability on the surface, but it comes from an entirely different place. Avoidant unavailability is rooted in fear and self-protection. Indifference, rooted in self-respect, is grounded, calm, and intentional. This difference is subtle but profound, and avoidants feel it immediately. When their emotional unavailability is reflected back through indifference, they expect to feel empowered. Instead, they often feel destabilized. The strategy they believed signaled strength now produces discomfort. The distance they once used to feel safe no longer generates admiration or pursuit. Instead, it creates emotional neutrality. And neutrality offers no validation. This is where confusion sets in. If emotional unavailability truly equals strength, then why does it feel so uncomfortable when someone else embodies it without fear? The avoidant is forced to confront a contradiction. Perhaps what they believed was strength was actually avoidance. Perhaps what they dismissed as neediness was actually emotional courage. Indifference exposes the difference between suppression and sovereignty. Suppression requires constant effort, monitoring emotions, controlling closeness, maintaining distance. Sovereignty is effortless. It doesn't resist emotion, it simply isn't ruled by it. When avoidants encounter this, they sense the gap between who they are and who they present themselves to be. There is also a loss of identity. Avoidants often define themselves as the one who is less invested, more rational, less affected. When someone responds to them with calm indifference, that identity loses its edge. They are no longer exceptional for being distant. Distance no longer distinguishes them. It simply becomes a shared state. This mirroring can trigger defensiveness or introspection. Some avoidants double down on emotional withdrawal, trying to reassert their sense of strength. Others feel an unfamiliar pull toward R&D connection, not because they want to lose control, but because they sense that the other person's indifference is not emptiness, but fullness. It reflects a wholeness that doesn't require distance to survive. In that moment, the avoidant glimpses a new possibility. That true strength might not be the absence of emotion, but the ability to remain grounded within it. Indifference becomes a silent teacher. It doesn't argue or persuade, it simply demonstrates that emotional availability and self-respect can coexist. What unravels the avoidant most is realizing that the very trait they relied on to feel powerful no longer holds power when it is mirrored without fear. Emotional unavailability, once mistaken for strength, is exposed as a limitation, and in that exposure, the avoidant is left questioning not the other person, but their own long-held beliefs about power, vulnerability, and what it truly means to be strong. Your calm detachment shifts the energetic dynamic and restores your personal authority in ways that avoidants rarely anticipate because they're accustomed to relationships being governed by a push-pull rhythm. In that rhythm, the avoidant maintains control by withdrawing just enough to feel safe, while the other person invests emotionally, often disproportionately. This creates a subtle but powerful power imbalance where the avoidant's distance is mirrored by the other's pursuit. The dynamic keeps them regulated while reinforcing their sense of superiority or autonomy. When you step into calm detachment, you disrupt this entire system. Calm detachment is not coldness, anger, or resentment. It is the deliberate choice to center yourself, your emotions, and your energy, independent of how the avoidant behaves. It communicates a profound truth. Your inner peace is self-generated, not dependent on manipulation, attention, or validation from others. For someone who thrives on controlling emotional engagement, this is destabilizing. The usual levers of influence, their withdrawal, ambiguity, or teasing, suddenly lose their effect. Energy is everything in human connection. Avoidants are highly sensitive to it because they navigate relationships through a constant monitoring of emotional currents. When your energy is reactive, anxious, or needy, they can exploit it consciously or unconsciously to maintain distance while keeping influence. When your energy is calm, steady, and detached, it communicates autonomy and strength that cannot be manipulated. This creates a new equilibrium, one where they are no longer the default regulators of emotional space. Restoring personal authority through detachment also involves reclaiming your time, attention, and choices. Avoidance often tests boundaries, seeking to gauge whether others will comply with their emotional withdrawal or tolerate their inconsistency. When you respond with measured detachment, you assert that your presence is intentional. You are not a resource to be taken for granted or a mirror for their control. This recenters the relationship around mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. The psychological impact on the avoidant is profound. When your calm detachment is consistent, it creates cognitive dissonance. Their habitual strategies, pulling away, signaling disinterest, or minimizing connection, no longer yield the desired responses. Instead of reinforcing their perceived control, they are confronted with someone whose equilibrium is not dependent on their behavior. This challenges deeply ingrained patterns, forcing introspection and awareness they often resist. Calm detachment also restores your sense of power because it shifts the focus inward. Instead of being emotionally entangled in their avoidance, you cultivate presence within yourself. Your validatio comes from your own alignment, not their approval. Avoidants respond most intensely when they sense that someone else is operating from a place of self-possession, rather than reactive engagement. The energy you project communicates that you are whole, grounded, and sovereign, which both attracts and unsettles them. Moreover, this form of detachment honors your boundaries without aggression. It demonstrates that you are neither punishing nor pleading, you are simply maintaining your integrity. Avoidants, who often define their identity around distance as strength, feel the paradox. Your withdrawal is not a threat or a plea. It is a declaration of wholeness. They are forced to recognize a dynamic where distance no longer equals leverage, but coexistence on equal terms. Over time, calm detachment reconfigures the relationship's energy. The avoidant can no longer manipulate the rhythm because the rhythm is self-governed by you. Your authority is restored not through confrontation but through presence, consistency, and self-possession. What emerges is clarity. Power is not taken by avoidance, but naturally regained through conscious, grounded detachment. Ultimately, calm detachment transforms the interaction from a psychological tug-of-war into an alignment of energies. You are no longer reactive to their avoidance. You are proactive in your own self-mastery. This is why avoidants often feel disoriented or unsettled. They have been used to controlling dynamics, but when met with calm, intentional presence, Their assumptions are challenged, and their internal equilibrium is disrupted. Your personal authority, restored through this energy, is magnetic, unshakable, and transformative. Thank you for your time and trust. It's been a pleasure sharing insights with you. Wishing you clarity, strength, and fulfillment. Goodbye and take care.